Daily Rambam for Monday, Chav Zayin Menachem of Tavshin Pei, third Perek of Hilchos Avoda Zara. So after we completed Hilchos Talmud Torah and over the course of Shabbos and Sunday began Hilchos Avoda Zara, so now we're moving on to Perek Shlishi. Over the course of all the Prakim of Avoda Zara, we're going to go through the 51 mitzvahs that the Rambam listed at the beginning of Hilchos Avoda Zara. So Perek Rishon, Perek number 1, was the famous introduction of the Rambam, the overview of how Avoda Zara developed, no actual halachas per se in there. The second Perek had mitzvahs 1 through 3, which included not to turn to follow Avoda Zara and leisasuru in general, not to follow your bad thoughts. And number 3 was Shleil Gadef, not to curse Hashem. And now in Perek Shlishi, we're going to go through mitzvahs 4 through 8. So that includes not to worship Avoda Zara the way that Avoda Zara is worshipped. The next one is going to be not to do general acts of worship like bowing, which are universal. Next 2 are going to be not to make an idol, either for yourself or for others. And the final one is going to be not to make images. So we're really going to learn the foundations of the whole concept of what it means to actually worship Avoda Zara. And according to halacha, whether it's serving it or whether it's creating it, this is really the fundamental halachas of Avoda Zara right here. Let's start. So we start right off with the first mitzvah, which is ha'ovid Avoda Zara, kol ha'ovid Avoda Zara b'rtzonai b'zadayin chayav kares. So whoever serves Avoda Zara worships it willingly on purpose, so he gets kares. His soul is cut off. And if on top of that there were witnesses and warning, then he can actually be put to death. He can be stoned. But Shraga, if it was an accident, some kind of misunderstanding, maybe chatos kavua, so then he brings a chatos, and the chatos doesn't change, as we'll explain in a second. So first of all, I think this is the first avera we have in the whole Mishnah Torah, where we're going to have the usual halachas of Amazing, you got kares, masra, skila, shegi chatos. So start getting used to regular halachas. So in the previous perek, he was still talking about more general terms of following after Avoda Zara. Here we're talking about dry halacha, real halacha, serving Avoda Zara, like what most of Mishnah Torah is, of course. Interesting to point out, these halachas are actually. You would think they might be in Masechos Avoda Zara and Mishnayos, but it's actually not. Masechos Avoda Zara Mishnayos deals basically with hana from Avoda Zara, things like that, deriving benefit from Avoda Zara, which is going to be, we'll have some prakim later on that focus on that. A lot of the details that we're going to learn here are actually from Masechos Sanhedrin in the Perek Dalad Misses, where it talks about the 4 punishments by death. So there it lists through some of the basic halachas, how you would get put to death for Avoda Zara, how you get skila, which is the discussion there, and that's what we're learning here. Now the Rambam wrote, it said, b'rtzonai b'zadayin, willingly on purpose. So to remind from what the Rambam says, and you say the Atayra Perek Hey, when it comes to Kiddush Hashem and Yaharik V'Alyav, right? So there are things you're supposed to allow yourself to be killed, you're not supposed to transgress. And one of them is Avoda Zara. But the Rambam says over there, if person succumbed, he didn't stand strong, the gun was pointed at his head, and he went ahead and he transgressed. So the Rambam clarifies that there's no lashes, there's no death punishment. Even if he murdered, obviously focus here is Avoda Zara, but the Rambam mentions there even murder. The Rambam mentions the word b'rtzonai over there. That's even though b'mezid, technically b'mezid could be without b'ratzon. You can know what you're doing, you know it's an avera, you know you're doing a bad thing, there's no misunderstanding. But there's a gun to your head, that's not purely b'rtzonai, that's not willingly. So there's also the element of b'rtzonai that's necessary. So that's seemingly what the Rambam is stressing here by saying b'rtzonai. B'zadayin, to call back to that point, that the mezid also has to be fully willingly, and being under duress takes away from some of your autonomy, some of your free will, so it's not purely an avera that you get punished for, according to the Rambam. Of course, there's a whole discussion there about the Rambam Shita, and the Rambam expands it to all averas, but the Mepharshim discussed it over here also, why only in certain halachas and Mishnah Torah does the Rambam use this double lashon b'rtzonai b'zadayin, but that's how we're going to understand it. Chatas kavua, of course, meant that there's another kind of chatas called the korban oila v'yared, where depending on your tax bracket, your financial abilities, so the korban might change. But this is a chatas kavua; it doesn't change. It doesn't matter what your financial situation is. All right. Now, so we said kol ha'ovid. What is ha'ovid? How do you worship Avoda Zara? We have to define that. So he's going to start off with, like we said, mitzvah number 4, which is serving it in the particular way reserved for that kind of Avoda Zara. So Rambam says in Beis, Avodas harbe kavu eved Avoda Zara l'chot tzelem v'tzelem l'chot tzura v'tzura. Avoda zeh eino k'avoda zeh. So the people that came up with Avoda Zara, they also came up with all kinds of modes of worship for every tzelem, for every idol, for every image, and you can't compare them. Each one is slightly different. Now, this language, this style of the Rambam, feels like a bit of a continuation of the style in Perek Aleph, where he explained the whole evolution of Avoda Zara. Uses the word tzura there a lot, that they came up with tzuras, they came up with images. So, for example, look over there, it says, days went on, Amnu b'nei Adam v'yei sheker, you had the false prophet to Amnu, she'akel tziva lehem v'amar lehem, this is still in the name of God. God told them, Ivdu keichav pleini, kol keichavim, and continues, Medilem tzura shabbatim, and first they said, worship the stars, and they said, this image represents the stars, so worship the image. And this is the image that I have, and I'm skipping through, but the priests would tell them, if you do this a particular worship, then it's going to be good for you. Do this, don't do that. And there were even more kaizim that said that the koichav itself, etc., came to them and said, if duni bekach v'kach, v'edilam derech avidasa, he said, this is how you should do it, v'asukach, v'altasukach. He says, v'pasha davar zeh b'chol ha'olam, is spread across the world, la'avidus atzuris ba'avidus mishunas zumizu, that everyone, each idol has its own unique kind of mode of worship. So this is where the Rambam is referencing here, that these guys, they're making it up as they go along. So we're actually talking about, as we're going to emphasize here, this is all based on what they do. This is not, what Torah isn't saying how you serve these idols. Those guys, they're making it up, and we're paying attention to what they're saying for the purpose of this halacha.
It's about 1,000 years, huh?
That what Perek Aleph describes. Very long period. Yeah. Even Hamish Shalamabel is already. So now, for example, we could go in Perek. Shavedasa sheyif adam atzmei loy. Umerkulis shavedasa sheyizrik le'avanim or yisakum lefanav avanim yisaku or yisalik, same thing. So he mentions the two examples are Perek and Merkulis. Those are the two examples that are also mentioned by Chazal. So Perek, so let's say in the Mishnah, it says Perek out in Sanhedrin, Perek out in the Baal Perek, Zu Avedasa. Zedek and Merkulis, Zu Avedasa. These are always the two classic examples that we always discuss in other videos. So we don't get into a whole exhaustive list of all the videos in the world. This is always the ones we choose to use as examples.
These four stories are very time apart.
So I'm gonna. So I was about to give a little bit of an overview of these Avodas. So Perek, or something that's called Baal Perek, which is apparently related to the idol Baal in general. So Baal Perek is mentioned in the Torah as being connected to Mayav, a Mayavi Avoda Zara. And I should point out that even over here, the word Perek, I think generally we're taught that it means the dafka to sort of do one's business. But I think at the basic level, it might just mean exposing oneself to Baal Perek. For example, the Torah doesn't ever mention. It just says that they were acting immorally and things like that. And I think even here, in the Rambam, might even mean just to expose oneself. So there's just some kind of immoral kind of behavior that goes on around Perek, as we see with B'nai Smayav, that situation there. Merkulis is mentioned in Chazal. Some identify it with the Roman god Mercury, so that it was a Roman Avoda Zara from their era. And Merkulis, Mercury, that there's a similarity there. The problem with that is that there's no outside sources that suggest that they worship Mercury with stones, because what we're saying is that Perek is that you for Adam Atzmei, which either is expose yourself or use the bathroom. Merkulis is to throw stones, or Rambam says, or to remove stones. So there's no other source outside of Chazal don't officially identify it with Mercury, and there's no other source about Mercury that says that it was stones. So some say there's another phenomenon we see in ancient times, something called the dolmen. These big stone structures and a lot of stones around them, and they find them all over the world from these ancient times. So maybe that was what the Chazal were calling Merkulis. And the tshuva of the Rambam that we mentioned actually earlier, to Ravadia Hager had this dispute over whether the Muslims are Avodah Zara or not. He said they're not, and part of the discussion was over the stone throwing in Mecca. So we had quoted the second part of the tshuva where the Rambam just stood up for Avadia's honor and castigated the Rav, his Rabbi, who had been very insulting to him. But in the first part of the tshuva, he says, the Yishmaelim, the other Muslims, previously there were Arabs, the Arab tribes, these Arabs in these places, they had Shleisha Mina Avoda Zara. He's testifying actually in more recent times before Islam. They had Pa'ar, Merkulis, and K'maish. These two plus K'maish. He says they themselves would admit to it. It's not like this is an anti-Islamic thing to say. They agree, they admit that they had these three things. And they have their Arabic names for it, but it's the same. It says Pa'ar, Avodasa, Sheyifar, Atme Lefanav. Again, it's an ambiguous word. I might just mean to expose myself. It says, or to put one's head down and lift up one's private area. He says, this is what when the Muslims bow in their prayer, that act of bowing, I guess they're not flat on the ground, they keep the back of their body up. He says that would be an act of pa'ar. And that's there's some continuity there in the way they pray nowadays. It says Merkulis is Avodas B'Regimas Havan, and Merkulis is throwing stones, which is what they used to do and which they still do. K'maish was worshipped by exposing the head, uncovering the head, and not to wear stitches. The clothing shouldn't have seam stitches, which would be one piece, I guess. It says, this is all known from before the Muslims ever started the Islam. So he's describing it as something that was actually relevant to his world. It's a realistic thing that the Rambam, even the idea of Pa'ar, which, as we said, it goes all the way back to Maya, the time of the Torah, but there was a form of Pa'ar still going on all the way up to before the time of the Rambam, before Islam. And then the Rambam continues and says that he admits that, okay, so in a certain sense what they're doing now is a continuation, but on the other hand, they give a whole new reason for it. They put a whole new layer over it, and therefore the Rambam's conclusion there is that it's not Avodah Zara. Maybe we'll bring the rest of what the Rambam says there when we get to Perek Test, where he talks about religions nowadays. But so that's the two that we're mentioning here. And he continues, and of course, there are many, many more in theory. These are just the examples that we always use. And therefore, practically speaking, if you do pa'ar to the markulis, or you threw a stone at pa'ar, pater, then you wouldn't be considered Avoda Zara, because the rule here is you have to worship it the way they worship it. So if you mix and match, then you're making your own thing up. That's not how you worship it. That the Torah is describing in Parshas Re'eh, which we just learned, describes that a person who wants to serve Avodah Zara, what does he say to himself? He says, how do they do it? I want to do it the way they do it. So here you see that's an important element. First you see what they do, and then you do what they do. And that says in Gemara Sanhedrin that this is how we know that even though they're just constantly making stuff up, the Torah still gives it significance, because the Torah says that the person asks, how do they do it? And adds, it's for this very reason that Beis needs to know all the ways that idols are worshipped. They won't be able to give skill, they won't be able to punish someone until they know for a fact that this is actually how it's done. So because we're putting the emphasis on and the significance on what they're doing, so it's really, technically this is really halacha that relates to Hilchos Sanhedrin, and it's mentioned in Hilchos Sanhedrin, but it's illustrating how powerful what the Goyim themselves do is with regard to this halacha, that it really all depends on what they're doing. So even if you're Sanhedrin, it doesn't matter that you know the whole Torah. You have to know dafka what these guys are making up right now. The Rabbi actually refers to this halacha in a letter to Rabbi Alter Hilevitz, which deals with learning other forms of wisdom according to halacha, according to Tanya. The Rabbi writes there that the Perek Beis, the Big Dalois, who's one of the earliest commentary on the Rambam. A lot of the later Mefarshim are very dismissive of him. They didn't feel that he was very helpful necessarily. He's always trying to defend the Rambam against the Ravid or in general, but they didn't necessarily feel that he knew his stuff so well, did such a good job. So one of the things the Migdalais, and the Migdalais was also very into Kabbalah, and he tries to, I think, bring the Rambam in line with Kabbalistic views. So the Migdalais says in Perek Beis that the Rambam himself, because it's Al Tifnu Al Halilim, we're not supposed to study Avoda Zara. He says the Rambam himself never studied foreign books of wisdom. So Rabbi Alter written to the Rabbi and said, if you look in the Meir Nevuchim, Chelek Gimel, Perek Chaptas, Perek Lamed, the Rambam himself seems to be pretty explicit about how he's very familiar with what the books of Avoda Zara say. Also, there's a letter from the Rambam to the sages of Marseilles. So the Rabbi says, I agree. Kengam Dati Nesenas. I think you're right, Rabbi Alter. The Migdalais doesn't seem to make sense. True that in Meir Nevuchim, you could still argue that maybe Ram doesn't mean to say that he actually studied it himself. Maybe he heard someone told him that those books, whichever books they are, say maybe the Migdalais would argue that. But if you look in, you mentioned Perek Chavtes and Perek Lamed. If you look in Perek Mem Tes, then you can't. The language there, you wouldn't be able to make that argument. He says what the Migdalais said is a plia to me. It's strange, and especially since the Migdalais seems to be familiar with Meir Nevuchim Chelek Gimel elsewhere. So maybe he says maybe the Migdalais thought Meir Nevuchim is a translation from Arabic. I'm wrote in Arabic, and old translations today we have new translations. Maybe the Migdalais thought that Meir Nevuchim wasn't so accurate. Maybe he thought the translation wasn't so accurate. And even though the language in front of us sounds like it says that the Rambam studied it, maybe he thought that the Rambam really didn't study it, and it's just a poorly written phrase. And maybe that letter to the sages of Marseille, which is very explicit, maybe the Migdalais didn't see that letter. Because Migdalais should have still acknowledged the Meir Nevuchim. He should have said, this is how I understand the Meir Nevuchim, not to pretend. But what's the connection to here? Rabbi ends off, Rambam, Lama lehevi biyadai, meaning in the Yad Hazak, which the Rabbi calls the Mishnah Torah. Why isn't the Rambam bring the din, the lahavin or lahiris mutter? So you have a din, right? So over here we're saying that Sanhedrin has to know the Avodas. So that can mean studying the books, don't know, that's but the halacha from the Gemara seems to be that they could even practice kishuf, they could even practice Avoda Zara. They could even practice things like that. That'll be part of the lahavin or lahiris. You have to make sure you know what you're doing. This is how you do it. For that, this is a story in Gemara about Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Kiva with the kishuf that they were doing with the kishuim, the cucumbers or the zucchini. They would actually seem to be doing the actual act in the course of figuring out what not. So it says the Ein Zanishma Mashakos about Hilchos Avoda Zara Perek Malacha Beis Hilchos Sanhedrin Perek Beis. So the Gemara seems to say this. Why doesn't the Rambam say this? It doesn't sound like it here. As the Minchas Chinuch actually already asked this question. If you look in the Minchas Chinuch, so he quotes that Chashav, you do Ma'aser, you got skill. What about Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Kiva? He says, L'Islam shiny. If you're training yourself for a purpose, Lahavin Lahiris. And Minchas Chinuch, of course, that includes everything else. Kaisim and Chayver and Aynin and Menachesh and Oiv. And it says it's all included. But I don't see the Rambam doesn't bring this halacha. He says in Sanhedrin, it says Sanhedrin hoyu makirim bekishuf. So maybe according to the Rambam, they weren't allowed to do it. They had to somehow study by the goyim and let the goyim practice it in front of them, but not to actually. What about the story of Lezer and Rabbi Kiva? Tzarechim? So that's just the Rebbe's reference to this halacha. Let's continue. The beginning of halacha gimel is really the conclusion of halacha beis. V'azhara shel avodas elu v'chayetze behen hu shekasav v'leisa avdim. When it comes to lav and the punishments, you need to have an azhar. You need to have a pasuk where the pasuk actually says it in a negative form. You can't just say eich yavdu agayim ve'esakein. It needs to be don't do it. So where does it say don't do it? It says v'leisa avdim. So Place of them means don't do Avoda Zara. We don't know what that is. So Eicha Yavdu Agayim comes and teaches us that includes all the unique forms that the Avoda Zara come up with themselves, and that would be a full Leisa of them. It's a full form of committing the sin of idol worship. Now the Rambam continues to the other concept of general modes of worship that are universal to all Avoda Zaras, and that is mitzvah number 5. Says, this whole discussion that we had until now is only relating to other forms of, like we said, payer, zodegavim, not excluding bowing, sacrificing an animal. Mekater is burning incense. Manasech would be pouring wine or something similar. But if you do one of these 4, chayav, then you're automatically in trouble. Even if the actual worshippers would never worship it that way. Ketzad, for example, If you poured something for Pa'ar, or you sacrificed an animal to Merkulas, even if they never do that themselves, Chayev, you would be in Shal Shenemar, Zeveach, Lehim Yachram. It's a pasuk in Mishpatim that if you sacrifice to another god, Bilti LaHashem Lavadei, not to Hashem, so then your Yachram means you're in trouble, you're punished. And that's just the pasuk just mentioned sacrificing. What about the rest? That's what the Rambam continues and says. It could have just said Oived Alekim. Zvicha was included in all the Avodas. Why was it Lama Yatas? Why was it singled out? What makes sacrificing an animal unique? That's how you serve Hashem. And we already know that if you do it to different gods, you would also be punished. Whether that's the actual way of worshiping it or not. So now, so all the other modes of Avoda from the Beis HaMikdash that are unique to Hashem, special for Hashem, if you do it for another God, again, doesn't matter if that's actually how you're supposed to, or not how you serve it. That's from Zvicha we learn all the rest. That's we know all for it. But then Rambam says, that's where it says, but this is in Parshas Kisisi, you shouldn't bow to another God. To make you chayev for bowing, even if that's not the way you serve it. And that's the same for incense and for libations, pouring. Now, the Rambam just seemingly said that we learn it all from Zvicha. That Zvicha, when it was mentioned, got special mention to teach us, and anything that's unique for Hashem. And then the Rambam concludes and says, that's why it says, Leisa Shtachava. So do we need another pasuk Leisa Shtachava, or was the whole idea that we learn it all from Zvicha? So what seems to be the case here is that actually Hishtachavaya is the one that's really not an official form of Avoda in the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash is really three forms. There's sacrificing an animal, there's Ketores, and there's Nisuch. And we're about to say, throwing like the matter of throwing blood, Zrika is in the same category as Nisuch. Shtachavaya is not actually, there's no carbon which involves officially Shtachavaya. So that's why you needed an extra pasuk with Shtachavaya to tell you that it's also in line on the same line with the rest. And then once you have established that, then okay, now it all has the same halacha. Interestingly, the Rambam called this Shalei Shtachavaya, meaning Shalei Laved Ba'avidasa, and then the next one was Shalei L'Shtachaves. So interesting that he chose that as representative of the four that are designated, that are always Avodah Zara. So in other words, unlike the previous halacha where Beis Din has to go learn what they're doing, here it's the opposite. Torah Taka establishes what it thinks is Avodah Zara, doesn't care what they say, doesn't matter. More like we're used to in most halachas. All right, so and like we said, so throwing blood, so it's similar enough to pouring wine that we're not even going to count it as another one on the list. Now, and with our Avoda, you can only do Zrika with blood, and you can only do Nisuch with yayin, except on Sukkot there's mayim, but generally it's blood and wine. But we're about to learn now that in Avodah Zara actually doesn't matter what substance you're pouring or throwing. So Rambam says in Halacha Daled, Safas Lotzaya, Ishanisach La'avit Shalmei Raglayim. If instead of something respectable it was excrement or a poured urine, Chayiv is still Chayiv because it's the general act of pouring. It doesn't matter what you're pouring. However, it doesn't go for shchita. It doesn't mean if you shecht anything, you're always high. But shachat lo chagav, if you took a grasshopper, a locust, something from that, one of those creatures, and you slaughtered that, then you're potter. Unless that's a unique avodah for that avodah, but it's not included in the universal act of shchita. Or if the animal was lacking a limb, it would not be considered shchita universal. Shchita elam can again only unless that's a particular avodah zara requires only animals lacking a limb. So apparently, the term shchita only includes things that more narrowly fit the definition of shchita. So first of all, a chagav, you wouldn't describe that usually as shchita at all. It's just not the kind of creature you do shchita. It has to be behemoths, chayas. And apparently, lacking a limb is so sort of the opposite of what you would consider shchita in the sense of worship, that it's out of the equation. But apparently, pouring, it's any liquid, as we're about to say now, only liquid. But if it's something that's not liquid that can't really be poured, then that also gets excluded. So it's not literally everything. So now Rambam says, Avoda Zara, Shoiv Nanesa b'makel, if you serve Avoda Zara with a stick. So shavar makel b'faneha chayav v'nasaris. If you broke the stick in front of it, so that would be a way of worshiping it. And you're chayav, and the stick would become Avoda Zara. It would become aser because it was used for Avoda Zara. But zarak makel b'faneha, if you just threw the stick, chayav, but ve'ena nasaris. So you're responsible, but not, because I guess that's the derech of that of Avoda Zara. But in order to be aser, but we didn't really get into the halachas of how it gets aser. But apparently it has to be one of the four. The throwing the stick is not like throwing the blood, because the stick stays the way it is and blood spreads out. The Rabbi, by the way, argues on a lot of these details. He seems to be machmer and everything. We're not going to get into it. Now that Rambam adds another din, that be'atzem, you don't have to do any service or any worship. There's also a concept of just accepting the Avoda Zara as your God. If you accept any Avoda Zara as your God, chayiv skila, you already are going to get stoned. I feel like even if he picks up a brick and he says, "You're my God," that would be enough. Anything along those lines. It doesn't have to be a specific formula, as long as that's the point of what you're saying. Chayav, then you're in the hot seat. And there's unique halacha here that even if you take the dibur within the same breath, you try to reverse yourself and say, it's not. It wouldn't help. And in this skull, assuming you were warned and everything, you would get skila. And we had a similar halacha in Perek Beis with the Megadib, someone who curses Hashem. Also, there's no backsies. You can't take it back. Because apparently some things are so severe that the very act of saying it is just you did it. There's no way to take it back. And now to a very important foundation in Hilchos Avoda Zara. That doesn't really matter what your intention was, even if you thought you were mocking, you were doing it in a disrespectful way. If you serve Avoda Zara in the proper way, and even if it was purely in your mind, at least, to disgrace it, if you're still chayav. Ketzad, for example, a Perek from the Perek, as I say, both of these things, both of the examples that we've been quoting, are both inherently disrespectful. He's exposing himself. Zara Markulis, or he's throwing stones at it. Says, I'm not doing it in a respectful way, I'm doing it in a disrespectful way. No, because that's how you serve it. You are chayav, maybe carbon al Shraga, and you must bring a carbon for your mistake. Of course, you're not the chayav skila because you're still a shagig. You still you didn't intend to serve Avoda Zara, but you did it. That's a classic case of a shagig. You didn't know what you were doing was wrong, but you did something wrong. You can't say that I didn't. It's not Avoda Zara b'chlal. I did a different act. No, the act was the same act. To point out that early in Hilchos Talmud Torah, in the beginning of Perek Daled, we learn Amru Chachamim Kol Hashena LaTalmud She'eni Hagun Kilu Zarak Even LeMarkulis. That if you teach a Talmud who's unworthy, it's like throwing a stone to Markulis. Of course, we already discussed. The Alter Rebbe says that L'maisa you should almost always having to teach him anyway. But it's the idea being like the idea in this halacha that you think you're doing a good thing. You think you're throwing a stone at Merkulis, but it's actually not a good thing because that's how you serve Avoda Zara. So you think you're doing a good thing. You're teaching Torah to someone, but sometimes teaching Torah to someone might be a bad thing. So that's that concept. So the Rambam actually had mentioned Merkulis earlier over there. And now to the concept of to serve out of Ava and Yira, which may be which might be different than regular Avoda Zara. So Rambam says Ha'ovid Avoda Zara me Ava, someone who serves Avoda Zara of love. What does that mean? He loved the image. Malachta seemingly mean the craftsmanship. It was a very beautiful image. So he just felt like worshiping it because it was beautiful, not because it has any special power. Or it was out of fear. He was afraid it was going to hurt him. Which is what the people who serve it imagine. They imagine that it does good and bad to them. So if he accepted it as a god, then it doesn't matter if there's an element of love or fear here. As long as you say it's a god and it's an act of worship for that god, then you're chayav skill. But if it's purely av and yira, if you never actually accept it as your god, You thought it was beautiful, or you were just afraid. You were superstitious, but not in the sense of actually accepting that it's a God. Then even if you did it the exact derech avodah, the precise way, or one of the 4 avodas, you're actually potter. So it's possible to be it's like a totally different act because you never were doing it as avodah zara. This actually connects to you say that halacha b'hardik v'al where the Rambam said if you go ahead and you did it anyway, you might, whether you're chayav or you're potter. So the Gemara about Av and Yira, some say the Gemara is actually talking about that. The Rabbi over here says, "V'anu mefarshin me'avas adam u'meyiras adam." The halacha me'av and Yira is actually about someone threatened you, that kind of thing. Not that you love the avodah zara itself. That's not a thing. Or to fear the avodah zara. If you love it or you fear it, that means you're basically worshiping it. The Rambam doesn't acknowledge this concept. We're not getting into the whole discussion. The Ramach asks an obvious question. We just said halacha ago that if you're doing it levazaysai to embarrass it, then you're potter. So seemingly you didn't accept it as a god. You were just being dismissive. And here the guy's doing me'av of a year and he's potter, and over there the guy did levazaysai and he's chayav. So the Kesef Mishnah brings from the Rivash that someone who does me'av b'yira, it's more like an onus. It's more like someone who was under duress. Whereas someone who's doing it levazos, he says someone who's doing it to embarrass it, that's more like baratzin. It's closer to just agreeing, getting on board willingly. She says that's why over there would be a shegeg. Even there, it's still a shegeg, and here it's not at all. Okay. And there's more discussion of it, of course, in the Mefarshim. So now moving on to Amagapif. Avodah Zara Menashikla, Amachabed V'Amarbitz, Lofanav Amarchas Lovasach, V'Amabash V'Aman L'Chol Chayetze, B'Tedivi Kavod Ha'elu, Every B'Leisa Shenamar V'Lois of them. Now there are other forms of respect. So if you hug it, or you kiss it, or you're sweeping in front of it, cleaning in front of it, or you wash it, you pour oil on it, you dress it, you put shoes on it, anything like that is all an avera. It says leisa of them, so it includes any sort of servitude, any kind of service. These are also included. Remember, you're not getting malchus. It's not the explicit form of worship. There's something wrong with what you're doing, but you're not actually worshiping it per se. You're just sort of doing service for it. Of course, if the way of actually worshiping it is by putting shoes on it, for example, then that's why you did it, then you'd be chayav. Now we have a bunch of halachas about how not to appear like you're serving avodah zara, even if you totally don't mean it. Let's say you got a thorn in your foot and you're near an idol. Don't bow down, don't kneel, don't bend over to pull it out. Looks like you're bowing to it. If your money spilled in front of it, don't bend over and pick it up. Looks like you're bowing to it. You first sit down on the ground and then you can collect it or then pull it out. That way it's clear that you're not bowing. Another example, something similar. Ches, you have sort of a fountain, an idol with a fountain coming out of it. There's water streaming out of it. Don't use it as a fountain and drink. It looks like you're kissing it. It's coming out of its mouth. Sort of kissing it on the mouth. Now we're moving on to mitzvah 6 and 7 about not making an idol without worshiping. If you make an idol, even if you didn't physically make it, even if you didn't serve it, you commissioned it. Like you got malchus, you shouldn't have one made for you. Or vice versa, if you actually craft it for someone else, also if you made it for the Gentile, you also got you shouldn't make it. So you shouldn't have it for you. You shouldn't commission it, and you shouldn't actually make it, even if it's not for you, it's for someone else. And if you made it for yourself, then you actually did two, like a shtayim, because you both made it and you got one for yourself. Now we're moving on to the last thing, which is 8, which is about making images. You're not to make images for beauty, even if it's not idolatrous at all. You shouldn't make out of silver and gold. Silver and golden images that are just for beauty, because people shouldn't make the mistake that they are intended for idol worship. When we're talking about this, we mean the image of a person, not any shape whatsoever. We're talking about an image that looks like a person. Therefore, you can't, even in wood or in clay or in stone. You can't carve out the shape of a person. But only if the image is sticking out. Like the engravings you have in your room and things like that. The core. If you did this, then you get malchus. But if it's instead of sticking out, it's engraved inwards, or it's just a painting, like images on a board, or you literally it's not even a drawing, it's you sort of wove it into something. That is permitted, the image of a person. If you have a ring that has engraved on it a picture of a person, and if the engraving is sticking out of the ring, also you shouldn't keep it, but you can stick it into wax, because the image you're making in the wax is not sticking out, it's sticking in. And vice versa. If the image is sticking in on your ring, you can keep the ring, but you couldn't stick it into wax. The mirror image will be sticking out of the wax. You also can't draw the image of the sun and the moon, the stars, constellations, malachim, the angels. You should not make anything that's with me. You shouldn't draw the image of those who are serving me in the heavens, even on the wall. Now, there's a whole discussion, no time for it at all, but there are many shows that do have images of stars. There's chuvas from some Rabbanan that we see clearly. They made mazalas on the ceiling or on the wall, and there are ways to explain it according to some. According to others, you really shouldn't. But all other images of living creatures except man, or trees, those you can draw, even if it's sticking out.
Statue of president.